I knew many rich men in my lifetime, men who controlled vast fortunes, who lived in mansions, who commanded armies of workers, who moved markets with their decisions, who had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes, who owned everything money could buy. They were rich, undeniably rich, spectacularly rich, rich beyond what most people could imagine. But they were not great. I also knew great men. Some of them were rich, some were not. Some accumulated fortunes. Some died with nothing. Some built empires. Some built ideas. Some were famous. Some were unknown. But they were great, unmistakably great. Great in ways that money could not measure and death could not erase. There is a difference between being rich and being great, a fundamental difference. A difference that most people never understand because they confuse the two. They think wealth makes you great. They think accumulation equals greatness. They think the size of your fortune measures the size of your impact. They are wrong. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you the difference between rich men and great men. Because I was both. I was rich first, and then I tried to become great. And the difference between the two defined the second half of my life. A rich man accumulates. A great man creates. This is the first difference, the fundamental difference. The difference everything else flows from. When I was building Carnegie Steel, I was accumulating. I was taking iron ore and coal and limestone and labor and capital and transforming them into steel. And I was capturing the value of that transformation. I was accumulating wealth, accumulating power, accumulating control, accumulating assets, accumulating everything I could accumulate. This made me rich, very rich, the richest man in the world. But it did not make me great, because accumulation alone does not create greatness. Accumulation is about taking, about gathering, about building your own pile, about increasing what you have, about making yourself bigger, about expanding your control, about growing your power. Creation is different. Creation is about making something that did not exist before, something that serves people beyond yourself, something that continues after you are gone, something that improves the world, something that makes life better, something that solves problems, something that opens possibilities, something that lives beyond you. When I started building libraries, I was creating. I was not accumulating anything for myself. The libraries did not increase my wealth. They decreased it. They did not expand my power. They distributed it. They did not make me bigger. They made others bigger. They did not serve me. They served everyone who walked through their doors. But they made me great, or at least they started me on the path to greatness, because creation is what separates rich men from great men. Rich men accumulate for themselves. Great men create for others. Rich men build their own empires. Great men build institutions that serve everyone. Rich men take from the world. Great men give to the world. This is why you can be rich without being great. Many men are. They accumulate enormous fortunes. They control vast resources. They command great power. But they create nothing that outlasts them. They build nothing that serves beyond themselves. They give nothing that changes lives. They die rich but not great, forgotten within a generation, remembered only for their wealth, which is not remembered at all once the wealth is spent. But you cannot be great without creating. Greatness requires making something that matters, something that lasts, something that serves, something that improves, something that changes, something beyond yourself, something bigger than your own accumulation, something that continues when you are gone. A rich man serves himself. A great man serves others. This is the second difference. The difference in who benefits from what you build. When I was accumulating wealth, everything I did served me, every decision increased my fortune, every strategy expanded my control, every acquisition grew my power, every cost cut improved my margins, every efficiency gained benefited me, everything served my accumulation. My workers served me by producing steel I could sell. My suppliers served me by providing materials I could transform. My customers served me by buying products I profited from. My competitors served me by making mistakes I could exploit. Everything and everyone in my orbit served my accumulation. This is how rich men operate. Everything serves them. Their businesses serve their wealth. Their employees serve their profits. Their strategies serve their accumulation. Their power serves their control. Their influence serves their interests. Everything orbits around them. Everything flows toward them. Everything benefits them. This is not evil. This is not wrong. This is how you become rich. You organize everything to serve your accumulation. You optimize everything for your benefit. You structure everything to increase what you have. This is the game of wealth, and I played it better than almost anyone. But it is not greatness, because greatness is not about serving yourself. Greatness is about serving others, about organizing resources to benefit people beyond yourself, about structuring systems to help people you will never meet, about creating value that serves humanity rather than just serving you. When I built libraries, they served others. They served poor children who needed access to books. They served immigrants who needed to learn. They served communities that needed gathering places. They served generations who needed education. They served society that needed informed citizens. They served everyone except me. I gained nothing from the libraries except the knowledge that they were helping people. I made no money from them. I gained no power from them. I accumulated nothing from them. They served others completely, totally, permanently. This is what great men do. They organize resources to serve others. They build systems that benefit people beyond themselves. They create value that helps humanity. They use their power to empower others. They deploy their wealth to create opportunity for people who have none. They serve something larger than themselves. Rich men ask what serves me. Great men ask what serves humanity. Rich men optimize for their own benefit. Great men optimize for others' benefit. Rich men accumulate for themselves. Great men create for everyone. Rich men serve their interests. Great men serve human interests. This is why rich men are common and great men are rare, because serving yourself is easy, serving others is hard. Accumulating for yourself feels natural. Creating for others requires transcending natural instincts. Building your own empire satisfies ego. Building institutions that serve others requires sacrificing ego. Most rich men never make this transition. They serve themselves until they die. They accumulate until the end. They optimize for their own benefit their entire lives. They die rich but not great, because they never learn to serve something larger than themselves. A rich man builds monuments to himself. A great man builds institutions for others. This is the third difference, the difference in legacy, in what remains after you are gone. Many rich men build monuments, buildings with their names, statues of themselves, museums celebrating their achievements, foundations that preserve their memory, biographies that tell their stories, everything designed to keep their name alive, to be remembered, to be celebrated, to be honored, to achieve a kind of immortality through remembrance. This is ego speaking. The desire to be remembered, the need to be celebrated, the fear of being forgotten, the hope that your name will live even though you die, the belief that being remembered is the same as being great. But monuments are not greatness. Monuments are just stone and bronze and buildings. They preserve names, but not impact. They remember people, but not contributions. They celebrate individuals, but not the value they created. They are about the person, not about what the person did for others. When I built libraries, I put my name on them. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Carnegie Library, Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Institute, Carnegie Mellon University. My name is on buildings all over the world. This was partly egos. I am human. I wanted to be remembered. I wanted my name to survive. I wanted recognition for what I had built. But the libraries were not monuments. They were institutions. The difference matters enormously. A monument exists to preserve memory. An institution exists to serve people. A monument is about the past. An institution is about the future. A monument celebrates who you were. An institution continues what you did. A monument is dead stone. An institution is living service. My libraries serve millions of people today. People who never heard my name. People who do not know who built the library. People who do not care about my story. They care about the books, the access, the opportunity, the education, the service the library provides. Not the name on the building. This is what great men build. Not monuments that preserve their memory, but institutions that serve people. Not buildings that celebrate their achievements, but systems that create opportunity. Not statues that honor their lives, but organizations that continue their work. Not things that remember them, but things that help people who will never remember them. The difference is profound. Monuments serve the dead. Institutions serve the living. Monuments look backward. Institutions look forward. Monuments are about preservation. Institutions are about progress. Monuments honor the builder. Institutions serve the users. Rich men want to be remembered. Great men want to be useful. Rich men build for their own immortality. Great men build for others' prosperity. Rich men create monuments. Great men create institutions. My name might be forgotten eventually, probably will be. Names always are given enough time. But the libraries will remain. The institutions will continue. The service will persist. The value will endure, not because of my name, but because institutions that serve people well continue existing as long as people need them. This is greatness, not being remembered, but creating things that continue serving long after memory fades, not having your name preserved, but having your work continue, not being celebrated, but being useful, not achieving immortality through fame, but achieving immortality through service. A rich man measures success by what he controls. A great man measures success by what he creates. This is the fourth difference. The difference in how you measure your life, in what you count, in what you value, in what you consider success. Rich men count. They count money. They count assets. They count properties. They count businesses. They count employees. They count everything they control, and the more they control, the more successful they feel. The larger the number, the greater the success. The bigger the fortune, the more they have won. I did this for 40 years. I counted. I tracked my net worth obsessively. I measured my success by the size of my fortune. I compared myself to other wealthy men. I wanted to be the richest. I wanted the biggest number. I wanted to control the most. I measured my life by what I controlled. This made me rich, but it did not make me great. Because what you control is not a measure of greatness. What you control measures your power, your wealth, your influence, your ability to command, but not your impact, not your contribution, not your service, not your greatness. When I started giving away my fortune, I had to find new measures. I could no longer count what I controlled because I was deliberately reducing what I controlled. I was giving it away, distributing it, deploying it, losing control of it. By the measure I'd used for 40 years, I was becoming less successful. The number was going down. The fortune was shrinking. The control was diminishing. But I was becoming more successful by a different measure, by the measure of what I was creating. How many libraries were serving communities? How many students were attending universities I funded? How many researchers were advancing knowledge in institutions I established? How many lives were being changed by opportunities I created? This is how great men measure, not by what they control, but by what they create, not by the size of their fortune, but by the scope of their impact, not by how much they have, but by how much they give, not by their power, but by their service, not by their wealth, but by their contribution. These are opposite measures. What you control goes up through accumulation. What you create goes up through distribution. What you control increases when you take. What you create increases when you give. What you control grows when you keep. What you create grows when you deploy. Rich men optimize for control. Great men optimize for creation. Rich men want bigger fortunes. Great men want bigger impact. Rich men want more wealth. Great men want more service. Rich men measure what they have. Great men measure what they give. This is why the transition from rich to great is so difficult. It requires changing how you measure your life, changing what you value, changing what you count, changing what success means, changing from accumulation metrics to impact metrics, from control measures to creation measures, from what you have to what you do with what you have. Most rich men cannot make this change. They are too invested in the old measures, too attached to counting what they control, too identified with the size of their fortune, too dependent on accumulation as their measure of worth. So they stay rich but never become great because they cannot change how they measure success. A rich man lives for himself. A great man lives for something larger than himself. This is the fifth difference, the ultimate difference, the difference in what your life is about, what you live for, what gives your life meaning, what makes your existence worthwhile. Rich men live for themselves, for their accumulation, for their wealth, for their power, for their status, for their comfort, for their security, for their pleasure, for themselves. Their life is about them. Their success is about them. Their goals are about them. Their meaning comes from them. Their worth comes from them. Everything is about them. This is not satisfying. I know because I lived this way for 40 years. And despite becoming the richest man in the world, despite achieving everything I thought would make me happy, despite accumulating everything I thought would give my life meaning, I was empty, hollow, lost, because a life lived entirely for yourself is ultimately meaningless, because serving only yourself is ultimately unsatisfying, because accumulating only for yourself is ultimately pointless. Great men live for something larger than themselves, for a cause, for a purpose, for a mission, for humanity, for progress, for the future, for something that transcends their individual existence. Their life is about that cause. Their success is measured by that purpose. Their goals serve that mission. Their meaning comes from that contribution. Their worth comes from that service. This is satisfying. I know because I lived this way for 18 years, and despite giving away 90% of my fortune, despite reducing what I controlled, despite distributing what I had accumulated, I was fulfilled, content, purposeful. Because a life lived for something larger than yourself is ultimately meaningful. Because serving something beyond yourself is ultimately satisfying. Because contributing to something that transcends you is ultimately worthwhile. This is the fundamental difference between rich men and great men. Rich men live for themselves. Great men live for something larger. Rich men serve their own interest. Great men serve human interest. Rich men optimize for their own benefit. Great men optimize for collective benefit. Rich men accumulate for themselves. Great men create for humanity. You can be rich and live for yourself. Many men do. They accumulate enormous fortunes. They achieve great power. They live in luxury. They die comfortable, but they die empty because they lived for themselves. And a life lived for yourself is never enough, never satisfying, never meaningful, never great. You cannot be great and live for yourself. Greatness requires transcending yourself, serving something larger, contributing to something beyond your individual existence, living for a purpose that outlasts you, creating value that serves humanity, building something that matters beyond your personal benefit. This is why greatness is rare and wealth is common. Because living for yourself is easy. Living for something larger is hard. Serving yourself comes naturally. Serving humanity requires transcending natural instincts. Accumulating for yourself satisfies immediate desires. Creating for others requires delaying gratification indefinitely. Building your own empire feels rewarding. Building institutions that serve others requires finding reward in their service rather than your accumulation. Most rich men never make this transition. They live for themselves until they die. They accumulate for themselves their entire lives. They serve their own interests permanently. They die rich but not great because they never learned to live for something larger than themselves, because they never found meaning beyond their own accumulation, because they never discovered that the only way to become great is to serve something that transcends you. I was rich for 40 years. I accumulated $500 million. I built the largest steel company in the world. I became the wealthiest man alive. I achieved everything wealth could achieve. And I was not great. I was just rich, just successful at accumulation, just good at taking, just effective at serving myself. Then I spent 18 years trying to become great, trying to create rather than accumulate, trying to serve others rather than myself, trying to build institutions rather than monuments, trying to measure impact rather than control, trying to live for something larger than myself. I gave away $350 million. I built 2,800 libraries. I funded universities. I established research institutions. I created foundations. I deployed my wealth systematically for public good. I transformed myself from a taker to a giver, from an accumulator to a creator, from someone who served himself to someone who served others, from a rich man to something approaching a great man. I do not know if I succeeded at greatness, Greatness is not something you can judge about yourself. It is something others judge after you are gone, after enough time has passed to see what endured, after your institutions have served generations, after the impact of what you created is clear, after the difference between what you accumulated and what you gave is measured. But I know I tried. I know I made the transition from living for myself to living for something larger. I know I changed from accumulating to creating. I know I shifted from serving myself to serving others. I know I transformed from measuring what I controlled to measuring what I created. I know I stopped building monuments and started building institutions. And I know that those 18 years were more meaningful than the 40 years before them. That creating was more satisfying than accumulating. That serving others was more fulfilling than serving myself. That building institutions was more worthwhile than building fortune. That living for something larger than myself was more meaningful than living for myself. This is the difference between rich men and great men. Not the size of the fortune, not the extent of the power, not the reach of the influence, not the magnitude of the achievement, but the purpose behind it all. The service it provides, the impact it creates, the people it helps, the value it generates, the contribution it makes, the legacy it leaves. Rich men accumulate for themselves. Great men create for others. Rich men serve themselves. Great men serve humanity. Rich men build monuments. Great men build institutions. Rich men measure control. Great men measure impact. Rich men live for themselves. Great men live for something larger. You can be rich without being great. Many men are. Most men are. Almost every wealthy person is. They accumulate without creating. They serve themselves without serving others. They build monuments without building institutions. They measure control without measuring impact. They live for themselves without living for anything larger. But you cannot be great without transcending wealth, without moving beyond accumulation, without serving something larger than yourself, without creating value for others, without building institutions that serve humanity, without measuring your life by your impact rather than your fortune, without living for a purpose that outlasts you. I was rich. I became rich through accumulation, through serving myself, through building my own empire, through measuring what I controlled, through living for my own success. I mastered wealth. I won the game of accumulation. I became the richest man in the world. But I was not great, not until I changed, not until I transitioned from accumulation to creation, not until I shifted from serving myself to serving others, not until I started building institutions instead of just monuments, not until I measured impact instead of just control, not until I lived for something larger than myself. The difference between rich men and great men is the difference between taking and giving, between accumulation and creation, between serving yourself and serving others, between monuments and institutions, between control and impact, between living for yourself and living for something larger. That is the difference. I lived both sides. I was rich first, then I tried to become great, and I'm telling you the difference from experience, from living both ways, from measuring my life by both metrics, from serving both purposes, from knowing what each feels like, from understanding what each creates, from experiencing what each means. Rich is not enough. Accumulation is not enough. Serving yourself is not enough. Building your own empire is not enough. Measuring what you control is not enough. Living for yourself is not enough. None of it is enough. Not if you want your life to matter, not if you want to create lasting value, not if you want to be more than just another person who accumulated wealth and died. Greatness requires more. It requires transcending wealth, transcending yourself, transcending accumulation, transcending self-service, transcending personal benefit. It requires creating, serving, building, impacting, contributing, giving, living for something larger. This is the difference between rich men and great men. And I spent the second half of my life learning it, living it, proving it, embodying it, trying to transform from one to the other, trying to become not just rich but great, not just successful but meaningful, not just wealthy but purposeful, not just powerful but service oriented, not just an accumulator but a creator. I do not know if history will judge me as great, but I know I tried. I know I made the transition. I know I learned the difference. I know I lived both ways. I know I changed from serving myself to serving others, from accumulating to creating, from rich to attempting great, and that made all the difference. Not in my fortune, that shrank, not in my power, that diminished, not in my control, that decreased, but in my meaning, in my purpose, in my satisfaction, in my fulfillment, in my legacy, in everything that actually matters. That is the difference between rich men and great men. Now you know it. What you do with that knowledge is up to you, but you cannot say you were not told. You cannot say no one explained it. You cannot say the difference was not clear. The difference is clear. Rich men accumulate, great men create. Rich men serve themselves. Great men serve others. Rich men build monuments. Great men build institutions. Rich men measure control. Great men measure impact. Rich men live for themselves. Great men live for something larger. Choose which you will be, because you cannot be both. Not really, not fully. You can be rich without being great, but you cannot be great without transcending rich, without moving beyond accumulation, without serving something larger, without creating value that outlasts you, without becoming more than just another person who had money and died. I chose. I was rich. Then I tried to become great, and that choice defined my life. The choice between accumulation and creation, between self-service and serving others, between monuments and institutions, between control and impact, between living for myself and living for something larger. That is the difference. That is the choice. That is what separates rich men from great men. And now you know.